Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. The case begins in Dublin, not with sirens or a cordoned-off street, but with a gap in the day that never closed. Elaine O'Hara, 36, was last reliably seen near Shanganagh Park and Cemetery on the evening of August 22, 2012. Her car was located. There were no drag marks, no blood pattern, no burst of activity on scene to convert a welfare check into a homicide file. On paper, this opened as a missing person investigation. In practice, it felt like a clock that had stopped without warning. Elaine's profile mattered because it shaped the earliest hypotheses. She worked in childcare. In the weeks before she vanished, she had been a voluntary inpatient for mental health treatment and was discharged in August. That context, reported publicly at the time, meant investigators had to test for self-harm or voluntary absence before anything else. Bank movement, transit taps, and routine device checks were reviewed. Nothing decisive surfaced. No neighbor heard a struggle. No camera, at least initially, captured an assault. The line between left by choice and removed by force was thin, and it was all the Gardaí had. What kept the file active were small frictions in the timeline. Family and colleagues described routine behaviors, work obligations, messages answered, appointments kept, that suddenly stopped. Location references in recent communications hinted at planned meetings away from busy streets. There were indications of more than one handset in use. None of that proved a crime, but each element pressed the search outward from the cemetery and toward the coast and mountains where people go to be alone or to vanish. In towns like Duluth, murders aren't just crimes, they tear at the fabric of a quiet community. This wasn't Duluth, this was Dublin, and the data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. A procedure took over. Canvases expanded from Shanganagh toward access roads leading into the Dublin mountains. Officers rechecked route cameras, cycle paths, and car parks that sit empty after dusk. Analysts pulled call detail records linked to known numbers for gaps, bursts, or towers that didn't fit Elaine's normal movement. The early results looked ordinary. A day that began with routine tasks and ended without a traceable exit. No 911 call. Ireland uses 999, and no hospital readmission, no debit card retry after midnight. The line went flat. For the audience who study cases like this, the most dangerous period is the lull, weeks where nothing new happens and assumptions calcify. That didn't occur here. The case remained active, with scheduled rechecks and technical requests queued as Irish courts and carriers allow. If you're watching and thinking, how do you build beyond this? That is the work. You hold the last verified sighting at the cemetery. You preserve the car, you protect the family from speculation, and you set reminders to pull the same digital logs again later when a different query or a different drought might shift what is visible. Elaine is not a statistic in this report. She is the anchor. Every decision from this point forward, what to search, what to seize, what to test, stays tethered to her last documented movements and the absence of a crime scene where one would expect it. Miles away, a reservoir level will drop. In another direction, a dog walker will take a trail. Those events are in the future. Tonight, the file reads, adult female, last seen, vehicle secured, no immediate signs of violence, next of kin, informed. The investigation continues. 13 months after Elaine O'Hara was last seen near Shanganagh Park and Cemetery, the case moved for the first time on its own. A dry spell lowered Vartry Reservoir in County Wicklow. Local authorities were notified of exposed debris near the shoreline. Gardaí secured the area and began a targeted recovery. This was not a homicide scene, it was a waterline find handled as evidence retrieval with a clear chain of custody from the first bag lifted out of the mud. Divers and shoreline officers worked in grids. The first item with probative value was a keyring carrying a retail loyalty tag. Numbers on that tag were traceable. When investigators matched the account information, it routed back to Elaine. That single match justified deeper sweeps. Within days, searchers raised a small rucksack with personal effects, a pair of older model Nokia handsets with batteries separated, restraints consistent with adult role-play gear, and prescription eyewear. Nothing about those items proved a murder. Together, they gave the investigation a direction it had never had, a verified connection between a missing person and a disposal site outside Dublin. Processing was straightforward and slow by design. Items were air-dried, photographed, and packaged. The eyewear went to a vendor liaison. The serial and prescription data were checked against purchase records. The match to Elaine was clean. The loyalty tag's account history verified the household tie already suspected, tightening linkage. The rucksack and restraints were cataloged and held for trace. The phones were the priority. Even after immersion, subscriber identity module data and international mobile equipment identity numbers can survive. You do not need full content to build a trail, you need identifiers and timestamps. Specialists extracted what remained. The two handsets formed a closed loop, one number repeatedly contacting the other over months before Elaine disappeared. This is the kind of pairing analysts flag on site, not because of content, but because of pattern, frequency, timing, and location changes that move in tandem. The line of interest was not what was said, it was when the conversation stopped. On the night Elaine vanished, the messaging between the two devices ceased. No further handshake, no late-night ping trying to reconnect. The silence on that loop reflected the silence in the case file. From a procedural standpoint, the reservoir told investigators two things. First, someone transported Elaine-linked property to Wicklow and chose water as the disposal method. That is intentional behavior, not drift. Second, more than one item was dumped together, which speaks to an effort to erase a relationship, not just a device. The team documented exact coordinates and depth readings to lock down how the items clustered. If you are watching this and wondering why that matters, tight mapping protects the case later when a defense argues coincidence. The tighter the cluster, the harder it is to claim unrelated loss. There is a human dimension, even in a sterile lab. Elaine's family had gone more than a year without answers. The reservoir finds gave them a dateable action in the aftermath of her disappearance. They also gave investigators a new search vector. If a person took phones and personal items to water, where did that person go in the hours before and after? Which towers did the phones touch last? Which roads feed the reservoir that also connect back toward Dublin? In towns like Duluth, murders aren't just crimes, they tear at the fabric of a quiet community. This was Dublin. The questions were the same. The work widened, then narrowed. Traffic cameras along approach roads were re-queried for the relevant windows in 2012. Carrier records tied to the two recovered devices were reissued under updated legal requests. Known associates were re-interviewed with specific questions about backup phones and off-grid messaging. None of this named a suspect in public. It did something more important. It split the investigation into two coordinated tracks: remains recovery in the mountains if any were found, and digital/physical linkage from the waterline back to Elaine's last known movements. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. Here, it was finally the way forward. 13 months after Elaine O'Hara was last seen, a dog walker cut through woodland paths on the Dublin Mountains and reported bone fragments and clothing near Killikee. Gardaí sealed the area, logged coordinates, and began a systematic sweep. This was handled as a recovery site, not the original homicide scene. Teams flagged surface finds, photographed them in place, and collected them in sequence so position could be reconstructed later if needed. The terrain showed ordinary weathering, no obvious trace patterns pointed to a struggle there. What the site offered was confirmation that the missing person file had become a death investigation. Over the following days, searchers expanded the grid. Additional remains were located within a defined perimeter, consistent with natural movement over time. Analysts estimated that roughly 2/3 of a skeleton would eventually be recovered. Clothing remnants were cataloged and held for comparison to known items from Elaine's home. The priority moved quickly to identification. Dental records are decisive when soft tissue is gone, and Irish authorities keep treatment histories that can be compared with recovered teeth and jaw features. A match was made. The remains were identified as Elaine O'Hara. Identification is not cause of death. That distinction mattered to investigators and to the family. The condition of the bones, exposure to the elements, and the time elapsed limited what a pathologist could say with certainty about mechanism. There was no single fracture pattern that closed the case on its own. The file stayed rooted in cumulative proof, a verified decedent, a verified link to property recovered from water weeks earlier, and a timeline that now had two disposal sites in two different directions from Dublin. The mountain gave identity, the reservoir had given association. Together, they narrowed a window of time and expanded the scope of where to look for the person who moved these objects, and most likely, Elaine herself. Processing the mountain site followed standard practice. Soil samples were retained to check for transfer material. Vegetation disturbance was photographed. not for drama, but to mark where scavenging or runoff might have shifted remains after deposition. Clothing fragments were assessed for size and brand markers to compare against retail records if serial details existed. Nothing at the site contradicted the working theory that the remains had lain there for approximately a year. Nothing suggested accidental death in that spot. Placement, not struggle, was the story the ground was telling. Once identification was confirmed, the investigative rhythm changed. Notifications to next of kin moved from uncertainty to fact. The timeline could be redrawn with a firm endpoint. Analysts overlaid the last known movements from August 22, 2012, with the mountain coordinates and the reservoir coordinates, then plotted plausible routes to both. Those routes run on real roads. They have toll points, cameras, and regular choke locations where vehicles queue. Requests went back out for any archived traffic footage, even if systems had cycled their storage. The phones recovered from water had already shown a closed loop of communication that ended the night Elaine disappeared. Now, the team had a body location to match to any digital signatures passing near Kalaki around the same period. There is a human piece to this stage that should be acknowledged plainly. Families live for the call that brings a loved one home. They brace for the call that confirms a loss. In cases like this, closure is not a headline. It is a folder of dates, signatures, and photographs that stop an endless waiting. The investigation stayed professional and direct with the family. Identification made, cause of death undetermined, inquiry active, next steps explained. Simple language preserves trust. The mountain recovery also set up the next move, expanding the focus from what happened after Elaine vanished to who had access to her life before that date. Without speculating, investigators prioritized connections that could link a living person to both sites. That meant cross-referencing apartment access, surveillance logs, and the recurring phone that engaged Elaine's device for months and then went silent. The point here was not to name anyone on camera or in public. The point was to lock the sequence so it survived the courtroom years later. Disappearance near Shanganagh, remains on Kalaki, personal property in Vartry, and a communication pattern that stopped at the pivot. It wasn't theatrical. It was linear. A brief note on expectations. Television leans on dramatic reveals. Real files lean on details that add up. Bones established identity. The landscape explained why trauma was hard to read. The mapped routes created investigative targets. Each piece is limited on its own. Together, they move a case from uncertainty toward charge. In towns like Duluth, murders aren't just crimes. They tear at the fabric of a quiet community. Dublin is no different in that respect. The difference here was the map itself. Mountain and water, 2 points that would soon meet a third, video. With the reservoir finds logged and the mountain recovery confirming identity, investigators pivoted to something that doesn't fade with weather: surveillance. The focus was Elaine O'Hara's apartment complex in Bellarmine Stepaside. Cameras mounted to watch entrances, lobbies, and the perimeter. The intent wasn't dramatic, it was practical. If someone had regular access to Elaine's world before August 22, 2012, a camera should have seen it. The review wasn't a single binge watch. It was a rebuild of calendar weeks from January through August 2012, cross-referenced against maintenance logs and timestamps. Systems like these aren't perfect. Housings fog, motion sensors miss, hard drives cycle and overwrite. Even so, patterns survive. Over that 8-month span, the same male figure appeared repeatedly on footage tied to Elaine's building, 9 separate days, spaced enough to look deliberate, frequent enough to be a routine. He didn't loiter. He entered with purpose and exited on predictable paths toward the lot or footway that feeds the main road. One sequence stood out. Midsummer, a date later anchored in a property log as early July. The pair entered the complex within minutes of each other, close enough to presume coordination, clear enough for analysts to tag both figures in the same clip. The angle wasn't cinematic, it didn't need to be. Entry time was recorded, and so was the exit. The clip alone didn't prove criminal intent. What it did prove was access, physical presence inside the space where Elaine lived within the year leading up to her disappearance. To prevent confirmation bias, the team ran parallel checks. Could the figure be a neighbor or a contractor? Building management provided access lists, repair tickets, and delivery windows. If an ordinary explanation existed, someone with a key card or a service call, it would show. The 9 dates did not line up with work orders. No access fobs were issued to match that shape and schedule. The man wasn't a ghost, he was simply not in the official record. Next came the overlay. Cell site analysis from the 2 recovered phones had already shown a closed messaging loop that ended the night Elaine disappeared. Analysts plotted the timestamps of heavy exchanges, bursts that often come before or after in-person meetings, against the 9 camera dates. The correlations were not perfect, but they were meaningful. On several of those days, messaging surged around the times the figure appeared at the complex. This is how a circumstantial case is built. The phone activity peaks, the person arrives or leaves, and the 2 stories start to tell the same story from different angles. The review expanded beyond the main entrance. Smaller cameras covered elevator landings and a secondary door used by residents when the lobby was busy. Footage there caught the same profile using the less crowded exit on evenings when traffic through the lobby was high. That detail mattered later in court because it implied familiarity. People who don't live in a building rarely know the quieter routes out. The man kept his head down, not in a theatrical way, but in the practiced way of someone who doesn't want to be noticed. Investigators were careful with language when documenting the sequences. Reports did not add adjectives or motives. They listed dates, times, entrances used, duration inside, and whether Elaine's silhouette appeared before or after. Only 1 clip showed them in proximity entering, and that was preserved with priority. For the family, none of this footage provided comfort. For the case, it provided structure. Elaine had a visitor pattern before August 22, 2012, and that pattern could be matched to the phone pairing found in water a year later. The next step was to push outward. If the same person traveled to Bellarmine, then left by vehicle or foot, other cameras might have caught the follow-through. A street-level unit near the bus stop, a shop-front camera that faced the roundabout, or a private system on the approach to the estate. Requests went out. Where archives were intact, footage was copied and time-aligned. Where archives were gone, investigators logged the absence and moved on. You don't need every angle to hold a case together. You need enough angles that point the same way. There's a human value in explaining why this matters. Elaine did not simply vanish into an empty city. The cameras didn't capture violence, but they captured access and routine. In towns like Duluth, murders aren't just crimes. They tear at the fabric of a quiet community. Dublin knows that feeling when a familiar doorway on a familiar block becomes part of an evidence map. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. Here, the alignment didn't replace judgment, it guided it. The 9 dates gave prosecutors a spine to hang exhibits on. Video here, phone spike there, and ultimately movement that could be tested against testimony. By the time the surveillance chronology was complete, the case had moved from someone met Elaine somewhere to a specific person regularly entered her residence zone in the months before she disappeared. The identity is still withheld at this stage of our narrative because pacing matters and because we are following the original order of proof. First, show the access, then show the messages, then show where the body was placed and where the property was dumped. Only when those pillars are solid do you attach a name. The reservoir gave investigators objects. The handsets inside that rucksack gave them movement and intent. Both were older model Nokias, prepaid and unregistered, what police call burners. Waterlogged or not, they still held identifiers and timestamps. Technicians pulled what they could without dramatics. Each phone's unique hardware number, the SIM history, and the outgoing and incoming records that show who spoke to whom and when. When the results came back, a pattern emerged that doesn't require guesswork. These 2 devices were built around each other. The message traffic stretched across months in 2012. More than 1,000 exchanges, short bursts, coordinated check-ins, specific meet instructions. Analysts didn't need to see every word to grasp the structure. One handset issued directions and set conditions. The other responded and complied. For labeling in the case file, investigators used the shorthand that appeared in some of the texts themselves, master and slave. That language matters here only because it describes control. It also explains why the first chapters of this story began as a missing person case. When someone lives inside a dynamic like that, sudden absence can look like a voluntary break until data shows otherwise. A few points cut through the noise. The controller phone often activated in the run-up to meetings, then went quiet until the next arranged contact. The recipient phone's movements matched places Elaine was known to be. On one key date in late summer, the controller number directed the recipient to go down toward the shore and wait. Shortly after, the pattern shifted. The regular back and forth that had filled weeks of 2012 traffic ended. On the night Elaine disappeared, the conversation between those two devices stopped and never resumed. Teams plotted the final active towers for each phone against the routes that lead out of Dublin toward the mountains and, in a different direction, toward the reservoir. The last pings alone do not tell you who held which handset at which moment, but they map opportunity and window. Layer that with what we covered in the previous section, the recurring visitor on 9 dates at Elaine's building, and the picture tightens. Access was documented on video earlier in the year. Now, control and coordination were documented in the text stream that ended on the critical night. This is where good cases avoid overreach. Messages that mix adult role play with real-world meetings require careful handling. Investigators didn't turn language into verdicts. They compared the digital patterns to physical results. 1 year after the text ended, both phones were in a lake. Eyewear linked to Elaine was there too. Restraints were there. That's not commentary about private behavior. It's a timeline about disposal. Someone wanted the conversation itself to disappear. Drowning both devices in the same body of water is not a mistake. It's a decision. Extraction records also solved a problem that families and juries quietly worry about. Could someone else have spoofed this? Burner phones aren't tied to names, but they are tied to behaviors. How often they move together, which towers they favor, which hours they wake up. The two devices in this case behaved like a closed loop. High-frequency contact with each other, minimal contact with outsiders, and a rhythm that tracks with in-person meetings seen on camera. Where the cameras show presence, the phones show planning. Where the cameras go silent, the phones still talk until they don't. There's a human reason to walk viewers through this with clear terms. Elaine O'Hara wasn't an online profile in a chat room. She was a person with a job and a family who, like anyone else, communicated on days that looked normal until the day that didn't. Frames like coercive control can sound academic, but they're useful because they remind us that consent requires the ability to say no and walk away. Data is not a moral compass, but here it did something irreplaceable. It documented pressure and timing even when no witness stood in the room. Small details carry weight later. For example, the controller phone frequently sent location-based instructions close to windows when the recurring visitor appears in apartment footage earlier that year. That overlap is not a coincidence you can explain away with routine maintenance or a lost fob. Building logs showed no authorized access for a person matching that pattern. The surveillance dates gave a skeleton. The messages gave it muscle. Both pointed away from chance and toward planning. Investigators kept the file language cold and precise. They noted the total volume of communications, the range of dates, the day the stream ceased, and the recovery of both devices from the same reservoir 13 months later. They avoided quoting unnecessary lines. They did record the directive to wait by the shore, not to sensationalize it, but because it set place and sequence. Their running hypothesis was straightforward. The phones show coordination, the cameras show access, the mountain shows where Elaine's remains were placed, the reservoir shows where the conversation was buried. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. Here, it was the path forward. Before we moved to charging decisions and names, the investigative team had one more step. Test these timelines against road cameras and any vehicle data that survived, looking for a carrier who could plausibly reach both the mountain and the reservoir in the windows that matter. That is how you close the last gaps in a case that began with no crime scene. You take a missing person file, a waterline find, a mountain recovery, a visitor pattern, and a two-phone dialogue that ends on the night in question, and you ask whether any other story fits all of it at once. Once investigators had 3 fixed points: last reliable sighting near Shanganagh Park and Cemetery, the remains at Killarkey in the Dublin Mountains, and the property dump at Vartree Reservoir, the case moved into a practical question. Who could have reached all 3 in the time that mattered, and how? This wasn't theory. It was mileage, roads, and cameras. Analysts began with drive times under normal conditions, from Shanganagh to Killarkey via the M50 feeders and mountain access roads, from Killarkey south and east to Vartree through County Wicklow back routes, and returns toward Dublin if the driver re-entered the city the same night. They plotted likely departure windows anchored to the last verifiable contact on August 22, 2012, and extended them into the early morning when roads are sparsely traveled. This set up a list of choke points where a vehicle would pass a lens, roundabouts with shop-front cameras, estate entrances, and the limited number of roadway cameras along mountain approaches. Where automatic number plate recognition existed, requests were filed. Where the systems weren't in place in 2012, or footage had cycled, that absence was documented. The purpose of the map was to test the phone evidence, not to replace it. The two prepaid Nokias recovered from Vartry had already established a closed loop of contact that ceased the night Elaine disappeared. Now the team asked whether any surviving camera hit or toll record aligned with device activity spikes preceding a meeting, or with the quiet that followed. In several short windows, they found supportive hits, a vehicle matching a recurring profile leaving the Bellarmine area on an evening that aligns with one of the higher messaging bursts earlier that summer, and later, isolated captures on approaches consistent with a route toward the mountains. None of these clips showed the interior of a car. They didn't need to. They added time, direction, and repetition. Because many suburban cameras were private, Gardaí went door to door where leads indicated gaps: petrol stations, pharmacies, independent grocers on feeder roads, and estate gates that residents sometimes covered for security. Where owners still had archival media, officers cloned the relevant segments. Where they didn't, statements were taken about typical camera angles and overwrite schedules to defend the absence later if challenged. Investigators also checked for small timing anomalies, clocks that ran fast or slow so that a 5-minute mismatch didn't create a false conflict with phone logs. The mountain portion of the map was straightforward. Kielecki has limited access points. Vehicles climbing after dark are noticed by locals or show in the occasional drive-by camera. The reservoir portion was different. Vartry has multiple pull-offs and less predictable coverage. The working assumption became sequence. A meet and movement near Elaine's world, a placement in the mountains, a later dump of property and water. The case files did not assert precise minute-by-minute travel on August 22nd without a camera to prove it. They presented corridors of opportunity that matched the device's final activity and the later recoveries. To keep bias out, analysts ran alternative narratives against the same map. Could two unconnected people have produced these traces, one moving a body to the mountains, the other dumping unrelated property into the reservoir months later? The corridor test made that unlikely. It required separate actors to choose two remote sites tied to the same victim and, coincidentally, to a phone pair proven to be in a closed relationship that stopped on the night she vanished. That scenario could be imagined. It could not be supported. What matters from a viewer's standpoint is how these maps guide action. The moment a route shows repeatable hits, you set surveillance targets for the next stage. The vehicle a person prefers, the times they travel, the roads they favor. You also prepare to explain it cleanly to a jury later. Here is the last known point. Here is where the body was found. Here is where the phones and property were recovered. And here are the plausible roads connecting them with supporting camera times. In towns like Duluth, murders aren't just crimes. They tear at the fabric of a quiet community. Dublin understands that. Maps like this aren't dramatic. They're how you move a case from suspicion to a charge that can stand. The map of opportunity and the paired phone pattern gave investigators a narrow lane to act. What they lacked was a name they could defend in court. That changed when the same male profile seen on 9 dates at Elaine O'Hara's apartment complex was matched to a person known to her offline. Graham Dwyer, an architect living in Fox Rock. The identification didn't ride on one angle. It was a stack, CCTV frames aligned to dates when Elaine's device traffic surged, building records that showed no authorized access for him, and digital extractions that labeled the phone dynamic as control and compliance over months in 2012. With Kielecki and Vartry fixed on the map, Dwyer became the only candidate who plausibly intersected the victim's life and those corridors at the right times. Detectives moved in sequence. They verified the linkages that would be tested later: his presence in and around Bellarmine on the documented dates, his communications pattern relative to the handset labeled as the controller, and any physical or digital trace that bridged his world to the reservoir and the mountains. Interviews were conducted, not to fish for a confession, but to lock down statements that could be measured against records. Devices and media were examined under warrant. The internal language of the files stayed neutral. Dates, times, entries, exits, tower hits, and a message loop that went dead on August 22, 2012. Arrest followed in October 2013. The charging document framed a clean theory. Elaine was contacted and directed to meet, removed from her routine, and never returned. Her remains were later recovered on Kilaki. Her property and the 2 phones were recovered at Vartry. The closed-loop messaging, ending the night she disappeared, and the repeated access to her residence earlier that year formed the backbone. Ireland does not require prosecutors to prove the minute-by-minute mechanism of death when the body is too weathered to show it. It requires proof that the accused intentionally caused it, and that the case's independent strands converge. Here, they did. What made the case viable wasn't volume. It was fit. The apartment footage proved access when there should have been none. The phones proved coordination that ended at the pivot. The mountain proved placement. The reservoir proved disposal. Roadway captures and route modeling supported opportunity windows that a single actor could navigate in one night. None of these parts alone carries a life sentence. Together, they eliminated competing explanations. The defense options you would expect, consensual role play, voluntary disappearance, unknown third party, were accounted for and addressed in the paperwork before the public ever heard the name. It is worth noting the human scale as the process turned. Elaine O'Hara's family had waited a year without a body and then watched evidence arise in 2 separate locations. An arrest isn't closure, but it is the first accountable step. The Gardaí kept their updates plain. The suspect named, the charge filed, the investigation ongoing, and next steps moving to court. In towns like Duluth, murders aren't just crimes, they tear at the fabric of a quiet community. Dublin knows that instinctively. An arrest restores a line between rumor and record. This narrative has held one line since the first section. No initial homicide scene, 2 recovery sites, 1 stream of messages that stopped when Elaine vanished. Identification and arrest didn't add drama. They connected the lines. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. In this moment, it became the reason the case could leave the station house and enter a courtroom. In court, the state promised a simple structure: access, coordination, placement, disposal, and delivered it without theatrics. Jurors saw months of traffic between 2 prepaid phones, a pattern of direction and compliance that went silent the night Elaine O'Hara disappeared. They saw a recurring visitor on camera at her Bellarmine complex across 9 dates in 2012, including 1 proximate entry in midsummer. They heard how Elaine's remains were identified from a recovery on Kilaki in the Dublin Mountains, and how a drained Vartry reservoir exposed 2 Nokias, a loyalty tag keyring tied to her, prescription eyewear, and restraints. Analysts then mapped realistic corridors connecting Shangana to Kilaki and Vartry, supported by surviving roadside captures and device activity windows. No single exhibit tried to do all the work. Together, they left little room for coincidence. The defense asked the jury to split those strands, to treat the building access as ordinary, the messages as harmless role play, the mountain as unrelated to the reservoir, and the abrupt silence on the relevant night as a fluke. The prosecution's answer was not a speech, it was convergence. On March 27, 2015, the jury found Graham Dwyer guilty of the murder of Elaine O'Hara. The court imposed life imprisonment. There was no second verdict later. That outcome has stood. Appeals focused on law, not narrative, specifically the treatment of telecom metadata. Across Europe, courts were tightening rules on blanket data retention. In Ireland, those rulings triggered challenges, including in this case. Appellate judges reviewed whether the call record evidence, timestamps, device relationships, activity windows, was properly admitted. In March 2023, the Court of Appeal upheld the conviction. In mid-2024, the Supreme Court confirmed that the phone evidence was admissible, especially when seen alongside independent lines of proof, repeated unauthorized access on camera, identification of remains, and the separate recovery of property tied to Elaine. As of October 11, 2025, Dwyer's life sentence remains in force. What matters beyond the verdict is clarity. This case was never about one dramatic clue. It was about independent facts that reinforced each other: regular access where none should have existed, a 2-phone dialogue that stopped on the night Elaine vanished, a body placed in the mountains, a conversation and personal property dumped in water. Good investigations don't guess. They reduce possibilities until one sequence still fits everything that can be proven. It also matters how we talk about people. Elaine O'Hara was not a set of exhibits. She worked in childcare, managed treatment, and tried to keep going. The record shows a dynamic of control masked as consent. Labels don't change what happened, but naming coercive patterns early can. If something in a relationship feels scripted by someone else, multiple phones, secret meetups, isolation from routine, tell someone. Privacy and safety aren't rivals. They are both protected when evidence is gathered lawfully and completely. Communities learn from cases like this in quiet ways. Cameras that confirm presence. Serial numbers that anchor ownership. Dental records that return a name. Phones that, even when waterlogged, still carry the outline of a night. Each piece is limited alone. Together, they give families a sentence that ends with a period, not an ellipsis. So the record stands in plain terms. Dublin, Ireland. Elaine O'Hara, missing in August 2012, remains identified in 2013. The state proved its case in 2015. Higher courts examined the rules and left the verdict intact in 2023 and 2024. Status 2025, life sentence. Justice here was built, not found, and it holds. I've walked you through Elaine O'Hara's case, and here's what I carry forward. Real safety starts with small check-ins, documenting patterns, and telling someone early. Consent means the power to leave, no exceptions. Tech trails aren't invasive, they're lifelines when silence falls. What matters most to you, the independent strands lining up, or a single smoking gun? Did this change how you read risk? If this story spoke to you, comment and tell me where you're watching from. If it didn't, tell me why. I'm listening. And if you want more clear, respectful, true crime, please subscribe to the channel and stay with us.